In your answers just now, you pointed to the responsibility of governments and companies. Our next speaker, which you have already met, has experience from both as the former Prime Minister of New Zealand and a global leader on the responsibility of business as the chair of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. It's an honor to welcome back Helen Clark. She will give a keynote titled Transparency and Good Governance, Essential Pillars for Financing Development. Please give her a warm welcome back to the stage.
Well, greetings, everyone. The risk of speaking in the last session is that everything which could have been said has been said. But a great deal of the debate today has been about global public finance, and I applaud all efforts to develop new approaches to that, including global public investment, which has very significant potential if we can keep the spirit of global solidarity alive, and also including the Bridgetown Initiative, which demands reform of the international financial system. And we heard strong hopes from the representative of the UN, Naveed, about what the conference in Seville might deliver on that. My recollection of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda of 2015, and I was at the conference in Addis Ababa as head of UNDP, was its call for the mobilization of all possible sources of financing for development, domestic and international sources, public and private. And I always used to add to that mantra, developmental and environmental finance, given what was already then the growing importance of climate and environmental financing instruments. It was already very clear at Addis Ababa that official development assistance in the form of north-south grant transfers was forming a relatively small proportion of the overall volume of financing required for development. But nonetheless, it remained then, and does now, an important source of support, especially for the least developed and low-income countries and populations, and increasingly in being recognised for the catalytic role it can play in a wider range of settings. In my view, that also includes support for improving governance practices. So now the member states are being called on to update the Addis agenda. And 10 years on, there's new challenges and there's old ones that have been exacerbated. Among the new, the fiscal strife caused to economies by the COVID-19 pandemic, the much higher levels of debt in the lower middle income countries, and the even more urgent need to fund adaptation to and mitigation of climate change. In all of these circumstances, all possible sources of finance and innovative approaches to raising and allocating capital have to be drawn on. But my focus today really is on domestic resource mobilisation, especially for the resource-rich countries. And I am speaking wearing that hat as chair of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI for short, which is headquartered here in Oslo. EITI provides the best practice governance standard for the extractive sector. That standard is being implemented by 55 countries, half of which are in Africa. Africa has embraced the initiative and embraced its core aim of seeing that the benefits of extracting natural resources actually flow through to citizens through increased revenues for countries, which can in turn be invested in human and sustainable development. More jobs, sustainable growth, and higher levels of investment are the virtuous cycle which can flow from good extractive sector governance. But of course, a virtuous cycle doesn't just happen. It has to be invested in. The institutions, the laws, the policies, the practices needed have to be in place for domestic resource mobilisation from extractives to reach its full potential. The potential for that mobilisation is very significant. The EITI member countries variously report revenues of between $130 and $350 billion from extractives each year. And those revenues often account for a very high share of a country's GDP, overall government revenue, and exports. In 34 of the 55 countries which implement our standard, the resource sector has accounted for between 20% and up to 95% of government revenues over those last 7 years. And of these countries, 14 are least developed countries or low-income countries. When the EITI was launched over 2 decades ago, in the early 2000s, it was apparent that the extraction of natural resources all too often was not a driver of inclusive development and domestic resource mobilisation, but far too often a driver of corruption and illicit financial flows. And so through the EITI and now through its standard, a range of reforms has been driven to address those challenges. And those reforms have spillover impacts which extend beyond extractive sector governance. Among the reforms we would say are necessary and which countries implementing the standard embrace are making transparency across the resource value chain the norm, not the exception, the norm. EITI requires full disclosure of extractive sector contracts, licensing, beneficial ownership and payments, so essential to fighting corruption. We require legislative and policy reform to achieve that. Implementation capacity is needed. And these are areas where catalytic development assistance can play a good role. Where there are state-owned actors in the extractive sector, there is often not so much transparency and accountability, but there are good examples of state enterprises in countries north and south which do operate transparently, commercially and profitably, and are examples of good practice. We also emphasise optimising domestic resource mobilisation through improving tax policies. Illicit financial flows and other practices which undermine taxation, such as base erosion and profit shifting, which I referred to earlier, have to be identified and addressed. I recall a very useful initiative which UNDP and the OECD collaborated on some years ago, called Tax Inspectors Without Borders. And it aimed to support countries to build the skills to collect the tax they should have been being paid. And tax inspectors from north and south were assembled in squads to go out and transfer skills. It was a very practical form of capacity development. We also promote transparent budgeting, as public revenue collection and spending can be quite opaque and inefficient. And we say the public's always entitled to know where the money's come from and where it's going to. We call for transparency not only at the central government levels, but also at the sub-national levels too. One of our tools is the multi-stakeholder platform on which we operate at the global level and at the country level. At country level, you will see the multi-stakeholder groups made up of government, industry, and civil society representatives. Their job is to help identify and counter the practices which undermine domestic revenue mobilisation, and they should also be widening public debate about the use of the revenues from the sector. At a time of energy transition, the countries rich in the critical minerals have big opportunities to leverage their resource wealth. But there's also significant risks. Where there is a sudden surge of interest in exploration and extraction, the possibilities of poor process, backhanders, bad deals for countries and communities, cutting corners on environmental and social requirements are all in prospect. And good governance of the sector is absolutely vital to mitigate those risks to sustainable development and resource mobilisation. The recent report of the UN Secretary-General's panel on critical energy transition minerals concludes that the pathway for the resource-rich countries to developing more resilient and more diversified economies requires deliberate and sustained policy efforts on value addition by building domestic industries. Without that, many countries will risk perpetuating a cycle of low-value resource extraction, vulnerability to price volatility, and low revenue returns. So, to conclude, we're in the lead up to Seville at the end of June. There is an opportunity to build a new financing framework relevant to the challenges countries face today. Effective domestic resource mobilisation is critical to that. And for the resource-rich countries with the critical minerals, this is an opportunity not to be missed. But it's also critical to get in place the institutions, policies, practices, and capacities to make that happen. Thank you very much.